What's going on, everyone, and welcome into Plazant's podcast, filled to the brim with glitchy analysis and freezing cold takes, so cold that they're boiling hot. In this episode, we are going to continue our college football preview. Today, we're talking about the Houston Cougars. Let's go ahead and hop into the star players. At quarterback, one of the best in the country, Donovan Smith. Big dual threat guy. I think he's going to be a 3,000-yard passer, 700-yard rusher this year. If Houston is going to have any success, it is going to be behind the arm and legs of Donovan Smith. They're pretty devoid of superstar talent on this Houston offense, but Donovan Smith is the exception to that rule. On the defensive side of the ball, we got Jamal Morris. He is going to lead the team in tackles. We're going to see this guy all over the field. If Houston is going to stop anyone before they get into the end zone, Jamal Morris is going to be the guy who's going to be trying to stop them. So he's the star to look out for on defense. Now let's go ahead and get into a couple of storylines. Number one, Dana Holgorsen is fired. Houston thought that they had their dream coach. He got hired in 2019. He left West Virginia for this job. Everybody thought that this is where he was going to retire, and even he thought that. In a New York Times interview, he was basically talking about his job security a couple years ago, and after a very disappointing season last year, going 3-9, he gets the can. Now, in come Willie Fritz. We'll talk about him in just a minute. Let's go ahead and get into the losses and addition for this Houston team. The losses side of things. Patrick Paul, offensive tackle, one of the best in the country. He gets drafted. And then Tyler Johnson, an offensive guard that started for this team last year. I think he started 11 games. He transfers and goes to Colorado. So two massive losses on the offensive line. And then incoming, nobody really terribly significant in terms of like making note of them, but they got a ton of depth and winners from Tulane that followed Willie Fritz into this program. Now, speaking of Willie Fritz, let's go ahead and talk about him. This is Willie Fritz, the rebuilder. This guy won at Sam Houston State, Georgia State, and now at Tulane. They beat USC in the Cotton Bowl in one of the most iconic bowl games of the 2020s. I loved watching that duel between Michael Pratt and Caleb Williams. It was amazing. But Willie Fritz himself, 7 out of 10 of his seasons in the FBS with Tulane and Georgia State have been winning football seasons. And you really cannot say that about a lot of Group of 5 coaches. It took a while for him to get the engine started there at Tulane, but once he did, he turned them into a well-oiled Group of 5 perennial contender. Back-to-back 10 plus win seasons. Very impressive. But his hands are full with this roster. Now, speaking of this roster, like I said, superstar talent, it's not really there, especially in the skill position group and the defensive back room. But this is one of the rare universities that you can pair with a big city. Obviously, Houston is in Houston, and there are so many businesses, so many wealthy people around the city that could contribute to NIL. The number one thing that Willie Fritz has got to recruit is not players first, it's money. If you can't get money these days, your program is basically shot in the foot before you even start. So getting business owners from around the city of Houston to contribute to this program, that's the number one objective to start this Houston Cougars team on the path to winning conference championships. So once again, a rare opportunity here to pair a college university up with a massive metropolitan area. It's very possible to turn Houston into one of the big perennial college football blue bloods, but it takes time and it takes money. Now, without further ado, this has come quicker than I thought, but let's get into this amazing record prediction. Unfortunately, the amazing part of it is not the record itself, but the predicting. Houston, I've got them going 2-10, and it is a brutal year for the Cougars. They start off the season with a win over UNLV, although I would not put UNLV out of sight, out of mind. That game could be closer than you'd like to believe, but then they really get reality set in at Oklahoma. I think this Oklahoma team is a top 25 roster. They have a brutal schedule, and I don't think they're going to end up that great in the record category, but I do think that they're going to get the ball rolling at home versus Houston. So that's an L right there. Then home versus Rice. I do think that's a win. Rice has not been a good football program basically in its history, unfortunately. But the Houston to Houston rivalry there, Houston gets the win over Rice. But then 9 straight losses. Oh, just absolutely brutal when you see a program go like this. At Cincinnati, hard to win on the road, even harder when you've got a team with a better roster. Hosting Iowa State, I think they have one of the best defensive back rooms in the country, and so I'm going to go ahead and just completely give the edge to Iowa State. Not to mention, I think they have a top 25 quarterback. I also think they have one of the best receivers in the country. I mean, we could go on and on and on about Iowa State, but that's a loss. At TCU, at Kansas, more of the same here with Cincinnati. 2 losses there, hard to win on the road. Versus Utah, versus Kansas State. Man, I looked at the schedule initially, but I didn't even think about all of the extremely tough games. I think they played the 5 best teams in the Big 12. Kansas State, Utah, Kansas, Iowa State, I think, is one of the best. Arizona is one of the best. The only team that they're really missing here is Oklahoma State and maybe Colorado. But let's go back to the schedule. At TCU, at Kansas, hard to win on the road, back-to-back losses. Utah and Kansas State, those are probably the first and maybe second or third best teams in the conference. Those are losses. At Arizona, top 5 roster on the road. That's a loss. Home versus Baylor. Now, this Baylor win could get dicey, but I don't see it happening. That's a loss. At BYU, probably the most competitive conference game on the schedule. I do give BYU the home field advantage just barely, and I give them the edge. That's a loss there for Houston. So 2-10 at Oklahoma is really tough. Like I said, you have a decent amount of young talent still left on the roster, but Houston, like we've seen, is not that patient of a place. When you get in there, you got to start winning pretty quickly, and then you have to sustain that success. So I do think that starting the season 2-10 for Willie Fritz's first season does set a low bar for the next year, which I think is a positive thing for his coaching career. But that's going to do it. 2-10 for Houston. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're going to be talking about Iowa State next, and we'll see you next time.